Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the very first session of our TEQSA Quality Assurance webinar series. My name is Joan Cooper, and I'm one of TEQSA Commissioners, and I will be hosting today's session on scholarship. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. We pay our respect to their cultures, country, and elders, past, present, and emerging. Before we begin, we have a little bit of housekeeping to do. Please note that we will be recording this event, and the recording may be used by TEQSA for marketing and publicity in our publications, websites, or social media accounts. For information about our privacy policy, you can visit teqsa.gov.au/privacy, which you can see on their screen now. I would also like to politely remind everyone to please keep your microphones muted so we can avoid any background interference throughout the session. Finally, today's session will involve me asking each of our panel members a question, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. The best way to post a question is to use the Q&A box on the right side of your screens, and you can do this throughout the session. You can also like another person's question, so we can respond to our audience's most burning questions at the end of the session. So please remember, it's the Q&A box, and if someone's already asked your question, then simply like that one. So, TEQSA publishes guidance notes to provide greater clarity for providers in the interpretation and application of selected standards. Guidance notes draw on our regulatory experience and knowledge of experts in the higher education sector. Our guidance notes usually focus on a single topic and typically cover the nature of the topic, the relevant standards in the higher education standards framework that relate to the topic, the underlying intent of those standards, the risk to the quality of education if the topic is not addressed sufficiently by a provider, the evidence that TEQSA is likely to look for to be satisfied that the requirements of the higher education standards are being met. We publish guidance notes because we have repeatedly been provided with feedback from providers that they constitute useful advice. Guidance notes are not standards themselves, nor do they seek to replace the standards, but rather they seek to outline the intent of various standards and provide non-prescriptive examples of the types of things TEQSA looks for when we assess the provider's compliance with the standards. So by way of introduction, I guess the first question to answer is, why is TEQSA reviewing its current guidance notes on scholarship? As many of you are aware, TEQSA is required to assess evidence on scholarship. We have a currently published guidance note on the topic. However, over the last few years, we've noticed that a small number of providers often find it difficult to provide evidence of scholarship when engaging with TEQSA. In particular, we often see what we would consider a professional development activity being confused with scholarship. We have also received the feedback from the various sectors on the existing guidance notes and thought it was timely to review the content. We are aware that scholarship is an important and complex issue, which in many ways goes to the heart of what is meant to be a higher education provider. And this is precisely why we want to encourage you all to contribute to our consultation process. Submissions received in response to this discussion paper will assist with informing revisions to the guidance notes on scholarship. And today we're here to listen to a range of views on this very topic. Our panellists today are all very experienced with the sector and the issues of scholarship. I would like to welcome our panellists, Dr. David Perry, Vice President Academic at Alfred Crucis College, Professor Merlin Crosley, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic, University of New South Wales, and Greg Simmons, our Director of Policy and Analysis Group at TEQSA. So how we're going to run today is we'll Each panelist will answer a question that I will ask, and then we'll go to the questions posed by the audience. So I'd like to begin with a question to David. David, can you please give us a brief background on what is important in fostering a culture of scholarship at an independent provider? And in your view, what are the key issues in relation to the discussion paper that you would like to explore further today? Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Joan, and great to be a part of this important discussion. My perspective on the question of scholarship really draws on our work at Alpha Crucis College as an independent provider and our journey towards self-accrediting authority. Our experience 5 to 10 years ago was that most of our faculty were already really heavily involved in scholarship at the individual level. I think the point's already been made that scholarship really should be intrinsic to what we do as academic faculty. So the first task for us as a provider was really just to capture and analyse the scholarship activity that's already happening. And like us, you might be quite surprised by what you actually find. Then the task becomes to move from scholarship as an individual activity that's already occurring to a more systemic and institutional culture of scholarship. And I actually do think it works better in that direction, individual to institutional. For us, that involves situating the individual scholarly activity within an institutional framework, then developing the reporting mechanisms around that, and also then intentionally recognising our faculty for outstanding achievements in scholarship. So we developed our own research and scholarship framework. I'm sure many of you have something similar, drawing from Boyer and others, which really just helped us conceptually to recognise, record, and evaluate the various individual scholarship activities and then relate them back to our institutional commitment to scholarship. And we also have a research and scholarship plan which helps us to look and plan forward. Clearly, scholarship's central to what we do and what it means to be a higher education provider, and I actually think most providers don't need the threshold standards to tell them that. You know, in fact, in just the last few weeks, I've participated in, I think, 3 forums and around 10 or more individual discussions about scholarship within the context of this discussion paper. So it's a topic that's energised the sector considerably, probably because everyone has a vested interest in any changes to the guidance note or the way in which TEQSA assesses scholarship. So that brings me to the second part of Joan's question. I thought the best contribution that I could make today would be to raise some of the concerns that I've heard in the sector about the discussion paper. And then that will hopefully give Greg and others an opportunity to respond and hopefully clarify the intention around some of these issues. So let me just talk quickly about 3 areas. Firstly, most of the concerns I've heard relate to Principle 2 in the discussion paper. And this principle introduces outputs and outcomes as a defining characteristic of scholarship. Now, everyone knows that in order to meet the requirements of the threshold standards, you have to be able to demonstrate that some scholarship at least is contributing towards teaching and learning or course development. And I haven't heard any objections to that. But to make outputs and outcomes a defining characteristic of scholarship so that other activities may actually be excluded on this basis seems to many to be a step too far. The concern, I think, is that if this approach is adopted, it actually amounts to a redefinition of scholarship and a significantly narrower definition at that. I've also heard concerns that such an approach would be too prescriptive, contrary to the stated intention of guidance notes. So I do think there is a significant concern within the sector about making outputs and outcomes not just a characteristic, but a defining characteristic of scholarship. Secondly, there was a concern about the onerous administrative burden that this would place on providers. Several providers talked about having hundreds or even thousands of scholarship items each year. So to go through and to maintain records of the intended outputs and outcomes, then the actual outputs and outcomes, and the causal relationships between these and curriculum development would be a massive undertaking, and I think some would say an unreasonable expectation. It's also been noted that sometimes the outcomes of scholarship, even excellent scholarship, can take years to materialise and would be incredibly difficult to demonstrate in the short term. The risk then will be a focus on demonstrable short-term outcomes in order to satisfy TEQSA could actually undermine or discourage the recognition of important long-term outcomes that often arise in scholarship. Finally, and still connected to Principle 2, I've heard concerns that such a prescriptive approach wouldn't create space for some of the unique discipline-specific approaches to scholarship, particularly in some of the professional and creative disciplines. I think overall my sense is that a number of the principles in the discussion paper are totally acceptable to the majority of providers that I've spoken to, and particularly the recognition in the discussion paper that providers can demonstrate that they meet the scholarship requirements of the standards in different ways is critical. But I do think there are some concerns, particularly around principles 2 and 3, and underlying those concerns, I think, is a sense that the definition of scholarship offered in the discussion paper with that outputs and outcomes as a defining characteristic could be too restrictive, too prescriptive, and possibly too onerous for providers to demonstrate. So I'm sure there are a number of people on the webinar interested to hear TECSA's views on those concerns. Thanks very much, Joan.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that very in-depth look at Principle 2, and we'll come back to that, Greg, in a little while. But first, I would like to ask Merlin a question. Merlin, in your view, coming from a university, what do you see as the key issues in relation to scholarship and the discussion paper? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. So thank you. It was great to hear you there, David, and thanks for organising all this. So we all want a high quality sector, and we all want a culture of scholarship improving student learning. And I think we all love TECSA, and we love TECSA because it upholds the standards in our sector. And I love TECSA as I would a big brother. And so I read these documents with great excitement. And then I talked to my colleagues about it. And when I read them, I wasn't expecting the Spanish Inquisition, but there were some who reacted with surprise and fear. And I was asking myself, what is it? How could these very interesting and carefully worded documents have created surprise and fear? And I think it's partly because of extending the scholarship to Boyer. So rather than using a typology, actually in the guidance note itself, a definition is used rather than a typology. Now, to me, scholarship just means deep learning, but even that's a little bit intellectual. I think of scholarship almost as nerdiness, and I'm very proud that I'm a nerd and most of our academics are nerd. And I think it is important that scholarship be a part of educational institutions, because we want education to be delivered by scholars, not by Uber Eats drivers. And I think of scholarship as the sort of quality, I don't know if anyone's as old as me, but if you've ever watched Antiques Roadshow, the presenters have this deep knowledge. They're not researchers. They're not asking questions. They have a deep knowledge, and it's vital for student learning, and it's inspirational. But what Boyer does is Boyer talks about different ways of being a scholar, and that leads to these activities. And that's where the fear and surprise comes from, because one of the statements is that a small provider might have to provide a list of all the activities over a 5-year period. Now, I know that's meant to be helpful, but I think that changes. We know that TECSA wants to look at frameworks, not activities. And I think that's caused some of the anxiety in the sector. Then, as David pointed out, the next step is, once you move to thinking of scholarship as an activity, the suggestion you can link that activity to an outcome. Now, I think a deep knowledge and an up-to-date knowledge can have an outcome in course design, and that's fine, but it's very hard to see how you could ever quantitatively measure the outcome on the students' learning or their future prospects. And so I think that's tricky. Another part I found tricky was the bit about the role of professional people contributing into courses. There's a discussion there about someone who might be on an audit committee, but unless they've ever done research or teaching in finance, that wouldn't count as scholarship. So I think this is, again, complicated. I think sometimes just being an example of someone as a professional can be very important. Now, I know the document's carefully written to try to accommodate that, but I think it's worth emphasizing that not everyone should be doing all the things in Boyer. And I think professional contributions are very important, and we've got to make sure we preserve that. And then research, obviously that's part of it too. But you know, if you want to learn Latin, you can learn it from a Latin scholar, not from, you don't need to be taught by an archaeologist. So again, to me, the problem is Boyer. Boyer was the paper in 1990 was for a different purpose. And I just think a simple definition of deep learning is greater. Now, people also get confused by something called the scholarship of teaching. And the scholarship of teaching, I think, is sometimes overrated and is again confusing. You do want, you know, I work in genetics, you know, you want people who are able to pass on the recent techniques, but there really is no research on different ways of teaching the structure of DNA. And I think sometimes people get a little bit carried away by demonstrating this. So what I would say is, I like the very last bit where there were two things. There was a creation of a climate of scholarship. I love that. I think we absolutely want frameworks, we want processes, we want methodologies, policies, and measuring those policies to ensure we have a framework. But what we don't want is a documentation of activities and a so-called list of their demonstrable outcomes. So I think this session will help us move towards a sort of understanding of that. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Merlin. Greg, perhaps we could start with the question relating to the concerns raised by David around Principle 2. Would you like to provide some clarity of outputs and outcomes of scholarship and what our thoughts were there?
Thanks very much, Joan, David and Merlin. Joan, perhaps before I address Principle 2 directly, I might spend a few moments outlining the 5 principles discussed in the paper or described in the paper. Of course, people are free to provide text or feedback on any aspect of the discussion paper, or in fact, the currently published guidance note covering scholarship at any time, including through this consultation period. I won't go into too much detail about the principles as the discussion paper has those details, but I think it's useful just to cover them broadly before we kind of move on to other questions. So I'll start with Principle 1, which is that to provide evidence of scholarship for regulatory purposes, the proposed scholarly activity must be consistent with an established typology or framework of scholarship. So Merlin referred to this in particular in his points just made. So we reference Boyer in the paper, which is perhaps the best known framework to classify scholarship. But we recognise that there are a number of other frameworks which exist, and we have no desire or intention to be prescriptive. So essentially what this framework seeks to do is just point out that we think there needs to be an institutional approach to scholarship, and it's helpful to actually have a framework to conceptualise that at an institutional level. Principle 3, I'll get to Principle 2 at the end perhaps. So Principle 3 talks about activities such as professional and community engagement, professional development, and routine professional practice will not generally be regarded as scholarship unless they can be classified under your framework for scholarship. And we point this out because in the past, text has been presented with spreadsheets from providers logging a range of staff professional development activities as evidence of scholarship. And whilst we don't discount that some professional development activity may include scholarship, we wouldn't generally consider this as scholarship unless it could be somehow conceptualised or characterised under whatever framework you choose to consider scholarship. So an accountant who would keep their CPA current through professional development activity wouldn't necessarily be engaged in scholarship. their activity may well be scholarship, but would expect that there's some kind of thought behind that. Principle 4 states that providers will be able to present a plan to create an environment of scholarship, which is then monitored and reviewed, together with an aggregate representation of their involvement in scholarship within the context of the higher education standards. So that plan, I would suggest, David, is one that is comprehensive, doesn't seek to narrow the definition of scholarship or insist that all scholarship must be linked to a specific outcome. So I'll get to outcomes in a minute, but we would think it's reasonable that providers have a plan to monitor their approach to scholarship and review their approach to scholarship periodically, because we think it's some issue of importance. We often see providers who have designated research or scholarship funds in their budget, but there's no plan to ensure those funds are invested wisely or the outcomes are monitored and reviewed. And so that's what we're trying to highlight with this particular principle. Principle 5 seeks to point out that TEQSA will accept different approaches to scholarship that reflects the nature of the provider. So we recognise that we have a diverse sector, and in particular non-research intensive providers will look to develop their scholarly culture in different ways, which aligns to their unique mission and context, and that's all we try to articulate with this particular principle. So finally, down to principle 2 and Joan's initial question and the issue raised by David about measurement. So principle 2 states that evidence of scholarship must include demonstrable links to intended outputs or outcomes, and that scholarship must be accompanied by mechanisms to monitor and evaluate those outputs or outcomes. So I think it's important to link this principle to principle 4. That is, if you have a plan and that plan is to be monitored and reviewed, there should be some outputs that are measurable over time. That doesn't mean that all scholarship needs to have an output and all scholarship needs to go into a spreadsheet, a 5-year list of activity. But there should be some outputs, and those outputs should link to your plan. The discussion paper spends some time drawing out, in particular, the section of the standards relevant to course design, which requires curriculum and pedagogy being informed by current knowledge and scholarship in relevant academic disciplines. But the principle is also broader than that. We don't expect that all scholarships fed back into your courses, but we would expect to see some evidence of outputs being incorporated into your course delivery in accordance with a clear organisational wide plan for scholarship. So our intention is not to narrow the definition of scholarship in any way, or for providers to take a short-term focus to the measurement of outputs, but we would like to see that there's some plan that feeds the output of your scholarship back into the student experience in some way. Just finally, before I hand back to Joan, the widespread interest in this event points to the importance of the issue and the complexity attached to the issue as well. I think it's important to recognise that none of the principles are set in stone. It's precisely why we're consulting with you all on this important topic. But they do give you an understanding of the current interpretation of the standards, or our current interpretation of the standards. And we hope you'll assist us all at TEQSA by making a submission before the deadline, if possible, next Monday. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Greg. Actually, before we move on to questions submitted by the audience, I wonder if you'd like to briefly, because I'm aware of the time, talk about what TEQSA is going to do with the commentary we receive from the consultation paper, and when are we likely to see a revised guidance?
Thanks, Joe. I can be brief on this answer. The consultation process closes next Monday, 14th of December. TEQSA will then summarise and consider the feedback we receive over the new year. We'll look to amend the current guidance note in light of the sector's feedback for consideration and approval of any changes to the existing guidance note for the TEQSA Commission. We won't rush the process. We aim to have the revised note published, I think, around about next autumn. As with all newly published guidance notes, it will be published in beta over the first 6 months, which means that it's subject to minor changes and adjustment over that period, should we receive further feedback at that point or feel the need to make those changes. I'd also like to stress that absent of any formal consultation process, you can provide feedback on our guidance notes at any time, and TEQSA will always consider the feedback we receive seriously. It's one of the reasons we decided to consult on this particular issue in the first place. Thanks, Joan.
Thanks. What we would like to do now is move to question and answers. I'd like to thank David, Merlin and Greg for their insights, and I'm sure some of the answers you've just been listened to have probably raised more questions with the audience. So we've got time for some questions, and I'm going to ask Justine to come online and take us through some of the questions from the audience. So Justine will come on and put the question, and then we'll ask one of David, Merlin or Greg to address it. So Justine, over.
Hi everyone, I'm Justine Baranowskis and I work at TEQSA, and today I'm asking your questions, so please keep posting them in our Q&A feed. And if you do see a question that you really want answered, just click the like button, because we're going to be working our way through the audience's most burning questions by vote of a popularity contest. So without further ado, I'll get started. So our first question that I've got here, Joan, is I'm keen to see any revision of the expectations for scholarship take into account more explicitly the diversity of academic staff appointments and circumstances, including part-timers and sessional staff, including industry experts.
Thank you, Justine. Merlin, I might ask you, in terms within a university and the diversity of staff you had, how would you like scholarship for the different people addressed from that question Justine just asked?
So, Joan, I think what I like most about Greg's response was that the scholarship should exist and the outcomes should inform things like course review and design. And I think that would be particularly important. So with big courses, you'll know that there'd be leading academics who often would be up with the latest research. There'd be more junior academics helping in tutes and practicals. And there may even be sort of PhD students as demonstrators. And I think the important thing is that you look at the refreshing of the course and how scholarship is having the outcome of that. So to me, that's the thing that I think we could do if that was focused, that sort of outcome to the course review. I thought that was quite helpful. Over.
Thank you. Thank you, Merlin. Actually, I might ask David if he'd like to address the same question from a private provider's point of view. Sorry, did that come through all right? I'll repeat just in case my screen didn't come live for a while. David, I just wondered if from the private provider's point of view, you might like to respond to that question.
Thanks, Joan. Look, it sounds like the context probably was a university setting, but I will say that from a private provider's perspective, that question, particularly around sessional staff, is one that's very relevant for scholarship. A lot of our sessional staff work very hard with limited time, often doing other work at the same time. And so sometimes the demands that we put on them in terms of scholarship can seem a little bit onerous. So I don't know what the solution is there, but I do think that's something that's worth keeping in mind. What we might expect in terms of scholarship from a permanent or even a part-time staff member will have to be a little bit different from what we might expect from a sessional staff member. And that might be where, you know, the institutional culture of scholarship is the overarching framework. And then within that, we have to be able to demonstrate certainly currency and discipline, but it might be a bit different what we look for from our different types of staff members below that institutional commitment to scholarship.
Joan, I might have a go at this one as well, and I'd just like to perhaps endorse what David said. So we're looking very much at the institutional level. That's how the standards are expressed. Notwithstanding David's point earlier around an institutional approach for scholarship being determined very much in a bottom-up fashion around the activities of individuals. And I think that makes sense in terms of determining a plan, playing to your strengths, understanding the staff that you have and their current interests. I think what we're looking for is the institutional approach to scholarship, and we recognise that the individuals, the academics who work at a provider, will each engage in scholarship in different ways with different intensity in accordance with their particular employment conditions and their interests. So some, to use Merlin's terms, some of the academics will be very deep thinkers and be very active in and engaged in the institutional approach to scholarship, and some will be more vocationally oriented. And what we expect to see at an institutional level is some kind of cohesive plan.
Righto. So thanks for that, panel members. We do have our next question. This one is regarding making outputs and outcomes the defining characteristic of scholarship of teaching and learning. How can those in teaching-focused roles without a research workload meet this requirement? The previous recognition that scholarship encompassed professional learning and development was supportive of teaching-focused workloads.
Thank you, Justine. Greg, do you want to address that question?
Sure. So thank you for whoever asked that question. I think David referred to it in his comments earlier. I tried to address it when I talked about our approach to Principle 2. So we certainly don't seek to exclude activity. That's not the intent of what we're doing here. And we recognise that teaching-focused academics have a part to play in scholarship. So we define scholarship as larger than just research activity. So perhaps Merlin's conceptualisation of the nerds and the deep thinkers is helpful in thinking about it in these terms. But I'd argue that teaching-focused academics are just as engaged in scholarship as research-intensive academics. It's just that the nature of that activity looks different. So we're not looking to define everything by outputs. And if the paper has been interpreted in that way, then that's something that we can reflect on when we update our guidance note. We do think outputs are important, but it's not meant to narrow the definition or to define all scholarship in terms of outputs. So that's not what we're seeking to do here. And we do recognise that teaching-focused academics have an important role to play and do engage in scholarship routinely.
Joan, I might have a go at that one as well, if that's okay. Greg, it was heartening to hear in your response to my concerns around Principle 2 that it's not the intention of the discussion paper to narrow the definition of scholarship, and that not every item of scholarship needs to have outputs and outcomes directly associated with it. And I guess that might also answer this question to some degree as well. And perhaps it could simply be, I do think that one way to read Principle 2 as it's currently stated in the guidance note, in the discussion paper, is along those lines, that TEQSA would expect to see every item of scholarship has a direct and demonstrable link to an output or an outcome. That might not be the intended way, but I think that's one way it could be read and could be interpreted. So it could just simply be a case of perhaps some clarifications needed on that point, so we know that that's not actually what TEQSA is expecting to see.
Righto. So our next question that we've got here is, can you please provide some examples of how institutions can monitor and review scholarship activities in an efficient and effective way?
Thank you, Justine. Before I ask Greg to answer what we might be looking for, I might ask both David and Merlin. I'll start with David, how their institute does that. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Joan. Look, I'll be really practical for a second, and the approach that worked for us might be entirely different to what might work, for example, for a large university. But yeah, our concern was efficiency and effectiveness, because we just don't have the resources to be able to waste time doing anything unnecessary. So we built what I think is actually a quite simple system. And we have faculty profiles on our website. Behind those profiles are records of publications, teaching responsibilities, community engagement activities, and we simply added scholarship activities to those profiles. Now, they're not visible publicly on our website, but it does give us a database that enables us to collect those activities. And recognising that at least some scholarship needs to be able to demonstrate impact, outputs, outcomes, we also have an opportunity for people as they're entering their scholarship activities into the database to also record the outputs, the outcomes, the impacts arising from that scholarship activity. And then we ask faculty to update that generally 2 or 3 times a year. We can generate reports, etc. So for us, you know, an independent provider, you know, needed to be efficient, needed to be effective, and the solution needed to be cost effective. So we didn't spend tens of thousands of dollars developing a scholarship system. We connected it to an already existing system and really just built a simple database in the background that enabled us to capture those activities and then the impact or the outcomes of those activities.
Merlin, I think we're with you.
So thank you. Yes, so we're more, we don't have a sort of database, and we don't keep a database of this. We're more aligned with ensuring that our courses are up to date by having the influence research informed teaching. And then, yes, we also embrace education focused staff, and the education community has many communities of practice and many events and an ongoing calendar of events where those things are shared across the university. So every staff member annually would be reporting on their updating of their research and or what they're doing with their teaching. So we would have all that. The third thing is in course reviews, having industry informed or community informed views feeding into the course reviews. So that would keep all of us going with that deep knowledge. Thank you.
Just Joan, I'd prefer not to go into detail around specific examples, because I think it's important that providers develop their approach to scholarship in a way that's meaningful for them. But what I will do is point out that the discussion paper itself highlights some work that was performed by Jeff Scott under the HEPQN. And there are some specific examples at the end of the discussion paper, which I'd perhaps refer people to from that research by Professor Jeff Scott.
All right, I've got another question then for you. All right, so can we have a response to Merlin's statement regarding the value of scholarship of teaching and learning? It appears it's a very positive driver for those in teaching focused positions, as well as sessional teaching staff who could collaborate on inquiries into teaching and learning practices. It also fits well with TEQSA requirement for ongoing improvement.
So Merlin, it's going to be you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joan. Thanks for the opportunity. And so first of all, let me apologise. I meant no offence by this, but the point that I wanted to make, and I think that I'm in line with people about the importance of this. The point I wanted to make was that publishing an article on teaching wasn't always enough or important. So I didn't like the idea that I'd come across at certain times in my career that if someone was education focused, they should pretend to be a researcher and publish a lot of papers. So there should be an equal number of papers coming out from researchers as there were from education focused staff. My experience was that some of our best education focused staff had an impact by developing and sharing best practice, by inspiring students and by serving as role models across the local community and ultimately across the world, without necessarily publishing research papers on learning and teaching. So that's what I meant by when I said, I need to learn some diplomacy from some other people on the panel. I said that I felt scholarship of learning and teaching was sometimes overrated. I think it sometimes is, but best practice communities and working on the best processes of learning and teaching is absolutely vital. And also educational research is vital too for academics whose discipline is education. But that's the point I wanted to make, clumsily though I did it. Over.
Justine, back to you.
Thanks, Joan. Just having a quick little look through this wonderful list of questions that we're getting. Keep sending your questions through, guys, and also keep liking your most interested topics. So our next question is there a concern within TEQSA or in the sector more broadly that universities or parts of universities are not undertaking sufficient scholarship? That is, what is driving this discussion paper? Is there evidence that this is a problem at the moment?
Thank you, Justine. I did outline at the beginning why we had decided to review our guidance notes on scholarship. But Greg, I'll throw to you first to address why TEQSA is reviewing this guidance note, and then we might ask Merlin what's happening in the universities. So Greg, you first.
Sure. Thanks, Joan. So I'll start by saying, no, we don't believe we don't have particular concerns about universities or any other part of the sector with respect to their approaches to scholarship. So we don't think there's a problem here that needs fixing, in that providers in the sector are not engaged in scholarship, be they university providers or independent providers. What we've observed over a period of time throughout the course of our regulatory activity is that there are occasions where providers find it very difficult to provide evidence of their scholarly activity, or evidence that they have an institutional approach to monitoring their scholarly activity. And that's why we thought it was useful to consult on this particular issue in the way that we have. We also are committed to routinely updating our guidance notes over time. And we have received, independent of any regulatory assessment work, feedback from providers on this particular guidance note. So that's why we're consulting. It's an issue of importance. We've picked up through our own regulatory activity that some providers find it difficult to provide evidence on this particular issue, and we've had feedback from providers on the existing guidance note.
Yes, and so I think, Joan, the reason Maya and some of my colleagues were anxious about this is because, in a way, scholarship is so deep in the DNA. Universities are simply an oasis where scholars find their home, and pretty much everyone who takes on a teaching role, be it teaching only or teaching focused or teaching and research, is deeply immersed in scholarships. That's what's their whole life mission is. And so the idea of having to document that at the scale we do is, I think, is at the core of why people are anxious about this, and then document the outcomes of that. But I can understand if new applications are going to be considered for registration, or as the sector becomes more diverse, if it does, I can understand that getting a bit more of a definition about what are already the core values in universities, I can understand why that might, why these conversations come to pass. But I think the universities were surprised because they did feel that, you know, there wasn't much more they could do. Certainly in my university, where we try to get our staff to be a bit less nerdy if we can. Over.
We were aware that this webinar was advertised to finish at 1:15, but we are going through to 1:30. So if you can stay with us, please do. We have time for at least one more question. So I'll go over to Justine.
Thanks, Joan. Well, I've got here more a statement rather than a question. So an overly prescriptive approach could stifle innovation in learning, teaching and research. And I was just wondering if the panel wanted to respond to that.
Thank you. Who would like to start? David?
Yep.
Would you like to
do
start?
that.
Thank you.
I mean, my response would just be amen. I think that was the point of some of the concerns that I raised earlier. So I don't know if I have much more to add. I will say, I mean, TEQSA has the preamble at the beginning of every guidance note, which says, you know, guidance notes are not meant to be prescriptive. They're supposed to provide guidance for providers. So I certainly understand that that's the intention. I think for independent providers particularly, I would agree with Merlin that by and large, that culture of scholarship does actually exist. A lot of the anxiety comes when we actually have to demonstrate that to a regulator. And I have had a good experience and a good relationship with TEQSA, so I'm not highlighting any issues there, but there is stress and anxiety that comes when there's a sense that we have to demonstrate some of these things, which we just do often instinctively to a regulator. So I think that that will be the concern if that approach becomes too prescriptive, that it will actually limit what we're able to do, because the focus then becomes, rather than just the normal activity of academia, it becomes activities that will satisfy TEQSA, that we're engaging in academia as they expect to see it. So I don't think that's the intention, but that can be the risk.
Greg, you're next.
Oh, okay. I think people can hear me. Well, I can certainly reassure people it's certainly not the intention of TEQSA to be prescriptive. I think it's a danger whenever we release a guidance note that people take them very literally. So as much care as we put into them to not be prescriptive, but also provide some examples that might help illustrate some points. There's always a danger that people take those very literally. There's also a danger that internally we take those literally, and we have to make sure that we have processes in place that our own staff don't take these things literally and take a prescriptive approach to things. So we're acutely aware of this issue. As Joan said, we've repeatedly got feedback from the sector, in particular smaller providers in the sector, that they find guidance notes so useful. And we have to put a certain degree of detail into the guidance notes for people to find them useful. But they're not meant to be prescriptive. They're not meant to be all encompassing. They're meant to provide some helpful examples of the types of things we look for. So we're not looking to be prescriptive in this area or redefine scholarship. We are trying to be helpful in this exercise, and we're generally interested in the feedback that you can provide us to ensure that the guidance we end up publishing is as useful to the broadest range of providers in the sector.
Thank you, Greg. Merlin, did you want to comment on that statement?
So I just say, I think the list at the end is quite useful. The only one, and I can't see how much innovation could be inhibited in teaching. Just the last one, there was one, TEQSA's view is that routine performance or production would not in itself constitute scholarship. And I get that, but this goes back to practitioners and professionals contributing real life experiences in teaching. I get that you might say that's not scholarship or it's not enough, but I suppose the questioner might be concerned that we might stop doing those things because it didn't tick that box. So I think that might be part of it. That's all I'll say. Over.
Thank you. Look, that's all we have time for today, unfortunately. I know there's a lot more questions that have been posted. These questions we will take into consideration when we're reviewing all the submissions as well in writing the next draft of the guidance notes. So thank you, even if your question didn't get answered. It will seriously be considered as part of the review of the revision of the guidance note. The scholarship paper is currently out for consultations, and submissions in response to the paper can be emailed to standards@texsa.gov.au. The consultation period closes very soon, the 14th of December, so if you want to respond, you need to get that response in as soon as possible. I'd like to thank our three panellists today, David, Merlin and Greg, who've shared their insights with us. Thank you for the issues that you've raised. Greg's got a lot to go away and think about. I'm sure they'll all be taken into consideration. I'd like to thank the audience. This is the first time we've done a consultation in this format. We had over 500 people registered, 560, I think. I'm not sure how many have joined us, but we're really very interested in the fact there's so much interest, as Greg said, out there. And I'm sure the input we've got today is going to guide us in the next version. So thank you to all the audience for taking the time and sending through your questions. We'll be sending out a feedback survey, and we'll appreciate it if you could please provide suggestions, ideas for future webinars, topics in 2021. As you can see on the slide now up, the next webinar session will be on self-accrediting and will be in February in 2021. And we look forward to you all joining us then. If you'd like to contact us all, please email the team at events@texa.gov.au. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you've gained something and some insights into what we're trying to achieve. And I certainly appreciate Merlin and David's comments and inputs today. So thank you everyone.